Welcome to Kingsdown School Creative Media, Unit R081, Lesson 1, Naming Conventions and File Formats for Evidence Suitable for Pre-Production Documents. In this lesson, we'll be looking at the necessary documents and the formats of those documents that we can use for evidence. We will look at the naming conventions that we expect people to use when storing all of their work, and when we need to send that off to the exam board, how that should look. And that will include such things as the type of name that you use for your file, what file extension it will be, and also if we need to use a version control, which is where we will sort the necessary edits of any particular file so that we know exactly which one it is that we're dealing with and the one that we should be sending off to make sure that there are no mistakes when the time comes. Okay, so let's dive in.
Today's lesson is to be able to understand the purpose, properties and importance of naming conventions and file formats, those suitable for pre-production documents. Now, the success criteria is that you will be able to identify and describe the key elements of naming conventions, how to apply them to your files and your folders, in addition to you being able to identify the most suitable file formats for your pre-production documents. Now, naming conventions. This should include the use of relevant words and phrases that describe the content of any digital media file. Now, most of you will have been naming things for many years, and sometimes you will get that very accurate and sometimes not quite so. When we refer to this in iMedia, it's really good to understand what it is you're trying to achieve. So as you can see here, if I took a photograph, say from a camera, if you imported that from the camera itself directly, it will probably be given a designation, as you can see there, just some letters and a number and the format that it's currently in. Now, obviously, when I rename that, it would be useful to know what it is that that picture is actually of. So hence, I've renamed this one School Entrance. So that I know exactly what the picture is of. Now, in most cases, it will probably be a fairly short descriptive name because you don't want them too long, although nowadays you can actually have them really quite long, and it used to be that the file convention said that you couldn't have more than 256 characters in a file name. That's not the case nowadays, but obviously the longer it is, the more difficult and unwieldy it becomes. So with that bearing in mind, you might want to add additional descriptive words. So as you can see here, I've added school entrance and then brackets small to denote that actually, although it is the school entrance, it's a relatively small file. And that should be reflected obviously in the file size that you would see anyway. But this is going to help also with your version control, because if you've got a description of a certain something and you have a different number of angles, perhaps, you might want to have a different version for each of those. So although it might be the school entrance, you might decide to do one straight on. You might decide to do one from one side. You might have one that's coming down from a different elevation, like from slightly above, or one that's shooting up from down below. Each of those would still be school entrance, and they might still be small file sizes, so they've got the small designation, but they'll have a version 1, 2, 3, and 4 to actually differentiate between the two. So, as you can see here, I've created a file system, and there my naming convention is quite simple. I've just stated that this is the R082, so whoever is coming to this knows that it's the R082 unit that this file appertains to, and it's actually an album cover, and the PPTX will tell most people straight off that it's a PowerPoint presentation. Obviously, for most of us, when we have that particular file type listed and we have that application on our computer, then it will give us an icon to confirm that. So there's naming conventions, but alongside that, as I said, you need to have version control. Now, the best description, if you like, of the use of version control is the one I've just given you, where you have got more than one version of what is effectively exactly the same thing. Now, this normally happens when you've got different edits, when something has been changed. Not the whole thing has been changed, but just something, slightly changed. Now, if you were working perhaps with moving pictures, film work, that might be happening more often, but it does still happen when you're taking pictures of a certain something and you take it from a different angle. For instance, if you were perhaps photographing a model, and you would try that with a certain number of poses, but each one of those poses may in fact have a number of different slight angle changes. That's going to change the way that the model looks, the way that the lighting affects that model, perhaps even the way in which the clothing that they're wearing will actually react to the light. So each of those things, whilst of the same shot, again, would have a designation here with the version control. And the most obvious way of doing the version control is actually just to put V for version and then a number so that you have the different ones. Generally speaking, when we work in any sort of media, if you've got a small change, then that small edit would probably be designated as a point. So you'd start off with your version 1, 1.0. Then if you added just a little something to that, may not be grand, but just change it just slightly, might be the same thing on a different day or a different angle, as I said, then you could have that as 1.1. Now, you can also use the version control to indicate slightly larger changes as well. So in fact, actually, if you were talking about your software, for instance, if you were using a different version of, say, Google, you might find that one from a couple of months ago will have a different version to the one that you're currently got, and therefore the starting number might be different. So I might have had one from last year which will be version 2.865 or something, and the version that they're on now is 3.412. It's the same software. It does mostly the same things, but something has been changed, and that little edit means that it's a different version, and that just helps people keep track of exactly what they have and what, if anything, they need to have in the future. So the most notable thing there, of course, is again with software. When you buy it originally, you buy it with the most up-to-date and current version, and it may be then that every so often that the software itself runs out and it actually checks with the manufacturers, have you got an updated version of this? And if they have, then obviously it says that there's a more up-to-date version. Would you like to download it? And then it will overwrite it. Now that can only happen obviously if the version of the file within your folder structure has got the version number attached to it, because then it can check it and compare. And that's what you want to be doing. You want to be making sure that any edits, any changes that you have where it is the same basic item but with either amendments or whether it's got changes, then that must be reflected within the version control that you use. So naming conventions basically is what you call your files in the first place, and the version control simply adds on a number. Normally speaking, it could be a letter, it doesn't really matter what you add on, but it's some way of differentiating that file from others of the same type and name. That's why we use it. I hope that's nice and clear. Here's an example of it. So in creating the R082 model or example that we have, I needed to create the cover, and the cover, as I went through it, I saved it on different dates, as you can see, at different times, and obviously with that we ended up with several versions of the same thing, but with slight changes to each one. Now, the other thing that version control can do for you, and invariably does do for you, is of course create a copy of what you had originally. So in this case, although I've got 6 different versions of the same thing, I've effectively got the situation where if in the end somebody turned around to me and said, okay, well, this book cover that you got, I didn't like that very much. The one that you showed me sort of 2 weeks ago, I actually liked better, but could you add something else to it? I could then very quickly go back to that one that I had, say version 4, which was 2 weeks ago, and actually use that as the basis to add on what I've been asked to add on. That would effectively become version 7, but its base has been from a different point, a different starting point, if you like. So that's the other very useful, um, if you like, effect of having version control, that you've got automatically backups. And quite often, if you're anything like me, you will quite often end up, in fact, with different versions on different machines that you're working on and then have to collate them all together at the end. But that in itself does give you a bit of a fail-safe, as I said, because if then one of your machines fails, you've got a copy elsewhere. And again, I would, generally speaking, advise most people to take backup copies of most of their work and store it in a different place so that you never get that situation where you have actually lost all of your work. You might have lost the latest edit or a couple of days work, but hopefully you won't have lost the whole thing. Right, now file formats suitable for creating pre-production documents. Now, in order to ensure that the coursework that we sent off for you is marked correctly and that you get the correct marks, if you like, and get all of the marks that you are entitled to, we have to make sure that you submit your work to the exam board in a file format that they are actually able to work with. Now, in general terms, we use for most of the moderated units PowerPoints, okay, and therefore any file format that PowerPoint will accept generally will be okay. But it is important for you to understand which file formats are most suitable for which documents. And by that, I would think you know what I mean in terms of graphics files. So, for instance, if you're creating, say, a mood board, now there are, of course, dedicated software for making mood boards. And once you've created your mood board within that software, it normally gives you an option of what you save that to. And for that type of thing, being a graphic, I would normally think that that would be saved as something like a PNG or a JPEG. Okay, so generally speaking, the graphic files that you want to be using are those graphic formats that you can put into your final presentation PowerPoint. Now, the exam board will accept other file formats. It will accept any of the Microsoft Office file formats, probably most of the OpenOffice file formats. It may even do the Google Docs and Sheets and files, etc. It does do quite a lot, but it's probably a good idea to actually go and find out what you're working with. I mean, for instance, I know, for instance, if you use SketchUp files, you wouldn't be able to use those. So the native SketchUp file format is not something that's recognized by OCR. However, if you export that, again, in PNG, for instance, then that could go easily into PowerPoint and that will quite happily satisfy the requirements of the OCR. Now, the places to look for this, you will need to go and look at the specification for this particular qualification and have a look in the Appendix B for the examples of the accepted formats. It's listed at the end of each unit. It used to come in a handy list called the Examiner's Toolkit, but that is no longer available on the website. So and that's kind of where you'll have to go. If I've set this work for you, I will attach a copy of the specification PDF so that you can have a look at that and you can carry out the task that I set you a little bit later. So the basic idea here is that you'll be using either a dedicated software, which then can be saved into one of these more generic formats, or that you will have used one of those generic formats from the outset. So if you're doing something that involves a lot of writing, like a report, then you'd expect that to be a word processing package that you've used, and hopefully one of the more generic ones, as those won't need converting at any stage. If you said doing graphics work, then PNGs I've already mentioned, but the JPEGs will be far more common, in fact, to most of you anyway. So that's something else that you need to know. If you're using any of the moving file formats, then again I would say WMVs or Windows Movies, MOVs, MP4s, or something like the GIFs. Those would all be perfectly okay, because all of those can in fact be stored within a PowerPoint presentation anyway. So you can embed them in the presentation, and that way you know that they're going to go and be correct. Now, it's worth noting that we have in the past submitted the PowerPoint presentations as actually a paperwork exercise. At the time of me making this video, I am still unsure whether they are going to continue with that, or whether they are actually going to actually ask us to submit in an electronic format from now on, which well may be the case. Whilst that shouldn't change, obviously, what you do in terms of the file formats that you choose, it will actually change the way in which you present that PowerPoint in the future. But that's something that you can work on throughout the time that you're creating it. So, file type that the work is created does not need to be the file type that is converted to in order to be used as evidence. When we're talking about pre-production documents, we need to be generic. You'll find this in other videos that I said. So therefore, pre-production documents should be created. If they're a graphical type of document, then they should be in graphic software. If they're a more writing kind of document, then they should be in word processing. If it's something that uses, things like what was it called? Best thing to example, the other example I think is probably something like the work plan. Work plans, generally speaking, will use something like a spreadsheet. So therefore, obviously, you need to have some sort of generic spreadsheet available to use. So formats suitable for pre-production documents don't necessarily need to be those that they were created in, but they do need to be generic file formats that can be submitted to the exam board. Okay, so a little activity for you now. In your books or on a fresh page, I would like you to create a table, as you can see below. I've done the first one for you, so you can see what I'm talking about. This will require you to go to the specification PDF for which I have attached, or to go onto the internet to find the same thing. You might want to go onto the internet and find out any specialist softwares that actually will create these particular documents for you. But just fill in the table there so you've got it clear in your mind. The fact that you might create something in a graphics editing software, okay, may mean that that is different when it gets into the presentation software. So in this case, I've put general presentation software. I might add to that the fact that it was a JPEG. It wouldn't really matter as long as I understand that that is actually what's going to happen. So use those mind maps, visualization diagrams, unit presentation, storyboard, scripts, and risk assessments to fill in the rest of the table. That should take you no more than about 20 minutes to do that. So you can either stop this video now, or of course you can do it at the end. Folder and file system. Now, we've spoken already, obviously, about the naming conventions that you use, and of course version control, but it's important that we do understand actually that for this particular qualification, the moderated units, they expect you to not only understand what the folder system and the file system is, they expect you to create it and use it. So you would be expected to create a folder basically for each of your units. Inside of there, they'd expect subfolders for each of the tasks that you are supposed to be carrying out. And obviously then within those subfolders, that's where you put your files with their correct file names and any version control that is actually needed. So as you can see on the structure opposite, I've created file folders for each of the 4 units, the 3 moderated and the exam one. And the most notable thing here is that obviously when you do that, you create a date stamp. and that's the evidence that the exam board are going to need in each of the 3 moderated units that you have actually saved your work regularly to that folder or file system. Okay, and those dates obviously tell them that that's something that you do on a regular basis. If you don't have regular updates on there, then it's going to be pretty clear to them that you haven't actually done what they have told you to do within the units. So that's why it's so important to get that absolutely spot on, and make sure that when you get back to school that those folders are reflected. Okay, there will be obviously some homework for this. You'll find that on the Show My Homework under Theory Lesson 1, Naming Conventions for File Formats, where you'll have the following questions to do, and obviously there's a quiz to go along with that. So, just to make sure that you've understood, if you would be kind enough as normal to answer these 5 questions for me, and then submit those by email so that I know that you've generally understood what is going on, and should you get any of those wrong, obviously I can point you in the right direction. Okay, so I hope you've enjoyed this little revision of why we need file and folder systems, naming conventions, and the version control. We'll see you next time. Bye now.